Good afternoon, and welcome to this session on the philosopher Socrates. My name is Peter Lamarck, and I'm Professor of Philosophy at the University of York, and I'm going to be chairing this session. Just a couple of preliminaries. The event is part of York Festival of Ideas Online. Although in a different format from previous years, the festival continues to aim to enhance York's reputation as a city of ideas and innovation through offering the highest caliber of public events. The 2020 festival has over 40 online events, offering an inspiring program for all ages. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the journey that we're about to take you on. Just a technical note, if you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the talk, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Armand D'Angour from the University of Oxford. He is the author of the book Socrates in Love, The Making of a Philosopher, which is the subject of our discussion. I'll say a bit more about him in a moment. He's going to present to us some of his fascinating exploration in the book into the passionate early life of Socrates and the influences that led Socrates to become the first and greatest of philosophers. Socrates' questioning, the Socratic method, laid the very foundations of Western thought, and his execution marked the end of the Athenian Golden Age. Yet despite his preeminence among the great thinkers of history, little of his life story is actually known. What we do know tends to begin in his middle age and end with his trial and death. Our conception of Socrates has relied upon Plato and Xenophon, men who met him when he was in his 50s and already a well-known figure in war-torn Athens. Armand's recent book, Socrates in Love, delves into the mystery at the heart of Socrates' story. What turned the young Socrates into a philosopher? What drove him to pursue with such persistence, at the cost of social acceptance and ultimately his own life, a whole new way of thinking about the meaning of existence? Well, Armand D'Angour, who's going to take us through all this, is an associate professor of classics at Oxford University and fellow and tutor at Jesus College, Oxford. He's the author of numerous articles and books, including The Greeks and the New, listed as Spectator Book of the Year 2011, and shortlisted for the Runciman Award 2012. He's written widely on Greek and Latin poetry, music, and literature. He was commissioned to compose Pindaric odes in ancient Greek, none less, for the Olympic Games in Athens in 2004 and in London in 2012. The latter were declaimed at the Olympics opening gala 2012 by Boris Johnson, none less, who was then the Mayor of London. Trained as a pianist and cellist, as well as a classicist, Armand has recently contributed to the rediscovery of the sounds of ancient Greek music. And incidentally, Socrates in Love, his book, is now available in paperback. Well, without more ado, I will hand over to Armand with great pleasure and great anticipation. Thank you. Over to you, Armand.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the York Festival for inviting me to talk about my book. And thank you to all the listeners who've come to hear something about Socrates. So when you think about Socrates, what do you think? Most people have an image of an older man, possibly bald with a beard, rather disheveled, who spent his life talking about philosophical issues, ethical issues mainly, until he was executed, and the death scene is probably the best known aspect of Socrates' life, and that is how he was given a cup of hemlock poison and drank that in his jail after having been put on trial by the Athenian state. So really the one thing most people know about Socrates is not his life, but his death. And the reason for his execution is not entirely clear. In fact, he was charged, there were 3 charges brought against him: corrupting young men and introducing new kinds of gods, and not believing in the conventional gods of the Athenian state. So 2 religious charges, and one which is slightly vague, this one about corrupting young men, which seems to have been a political charge, because although there's a slight sexual innuendo in the Greek word for corrupting, the clear indication from the context of the period was that Socrates had been a teacher of young men who had sought to be subversive elements to the Athenian democratic constitution of the time. During that period, the late 5th century BC, Athens was at war with Sparta. Athens and its allies went to war with Sparta and its allies, the so-called Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404. And in the course of that war, elite Athenians tried to overthrow the democratic constitution of Athens, which had voted on and seemed to be promoting a war that was very much detrimental to the interests of that elite. So you had what was called an oligarchic coup in 411 BC. And then when Athens finally lost the war in 403, there was another group of elites who became the leaders of Athens. And those people were known to have been associates of Socrates. Now, the democracy of Athens was restored in 403, and the Democrats who then took over felt that the people who had tried to subvert the democratic constitution should come to some kind of justice, but they passed a law of an amnesty. You weren't allowed to accuse someone of having been a supporter of those oligarchic coups or having been an anti-democrat. So one theory, and one that I subscribe to, is that Socrates was accused of being religiously unsound and a corrupter of young men, because the accusers were not allowed to actually say, you were part of that oligarchic group who subverted our democracy. So, a political charge. Anyway, this is what we know, what most people think about when they know about Socrates' later life. He was a philosopher, he was executed. What is undoubtedly the case is that one doesn't form one's ideas from the age of 40 or 50 onwards. You become the person you are when you're much younger. And so I did wonder what led to this amazing philosophical change. Cicero, the Roman statesman, said Socrates brought philosophy down from heaven to earth. The philosophers who worked before Socrates, the so-called pre-Socratics, tended to be interested in what is the world made of? How long has it existed? These kind of cosmological questions. They were interested in natural history, in the physics of the world, but of course they had no science, so everything they said was speculative. Thales said the world is made of water, Anaximander said it's made of air, and so on. Anaximander actually said it was made of something called the boundless. So you had different kinds of interpretations of what the world or the cosmos is. But Socrates said, look, we don't have clear answers to these questions, nor do we have any answers to the question, for example, how we think. Is it to do with the blood in our brains? Is it to do with our veins? We can't make those kinds of determination. So he said, what is important is how we should live. What is the good life for a human being? what is courage and truth and justice? What is knowledge? How do we know what we know? These are all the kinds of questions about human nature, about human morality that we should be thinking about. And part of the problem with those questions is that there are no determined answers either, but we can at least keep asking them. So Socrates decided that the right approach for a human being is to keep asking questions about how we should live. Famous quotation is that the unexamined life is not worth living by men. So examine what life should be and how you should live. That's what Socrates said. And he wrote down nothing. He was actually philosophically disinclined to the idea of writing because he said, once you've written down something, you can't change it. You need to be in conversation in order to change your mind and understand what's wrong about what you've said. So you need to be flexible in your thinking, because actually everything we say, this is just, this is true, this is courageous, is subject to further examination and might prove to be faulty on further examination. So this back and forth of conversation, what's called Socratic dialectic, is an example of how he believed knowledge itself is provisional. What I know, he said, is that I do not know. And he realized that that statement, that notion that I recognize my own lack of knowledge, was what made him cleverer than other people who didn't know things but thought they did. So one famous occasion in Socrates' life, which is reported on by the various sources to his life, was when he went to the Delphic oracle, the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, which was thought to be able to answer questions in a truthful fashion. And a companion of his, who was called Chaerephon, famously an impetuous young man, asked the oracle the question, is there anyone cleverer than Socrates? An extraordinary question to ask, and one that implies that whenever that happened, Socrates was already known to be a very clever man. You wouldn't ask that question otherwise. The answer came back, no, there is no one cleverer than Socrates. Now this was a stunning thing for the great oracle, which the Greeks on the whole believed in implicitly, to state. And Socrates himself says, I was baffled by this because I didn't consider myself particularly clever. So I went around asking people who had a reputation for being clever questions about justice and knowledge and truth. I discovered they didn't know what they were talking about. So I realized that what the oracle, what the god Apollo must mean, is that I'm only cleverer than other people because I know that I'm not clever. And he said that led me to go on my mission, which was to discover the truth by stripping away falsehoods, stripping away the assumption that you know something when you don't. And he spent much of his later life, we know, walking around the marketplace, the agora in Athens, and places outside of the center as well, subjecting people to questioning, to this dialectic, asking them what is holiness, or what is courage, or what is truth, and so on. And on the whole, not coming to any fixed answers, but getting them to think. And that's what he says in his so-called defense speech, the apology that Plato writes, supposedly recorded when he's put on trial. He says, I was a gadfly. I stung people into thinking about themselves. That was my mission. So this is a man who questions, who clearly annoys people by his style of questioning, and who eventually is executed for it, or perhaps, as I said, to mask a political charge. But the crucial shift from the pre-Socratic style of philosophizing, the notion that you have to look at what is in the heavens and the stars, in the cosmos, talk about the material nature of the world and so on, to this ethical approach, and a very sophisticated one, because it wasn't providing answers, but it was stating the importance of being a questioner. That shift seems to have happened earlier on in his life. And so I wanted to find out what we know about Socrates' early life. And this is where one comes across the problem of sources straight away. As Peter said in his introduction, the crucial sources for Socrates' life are two authors, Plato and Xenophon, both of whom were born when Socrates was already around the age of 50. So they wouldn't have met Socrates until he was quite an old man. So let's say they were in their teens when they met and associated with Socrates. Socrates then would have been already around the age of 60. And 10 years after that, at the age of 70, he was executed. And these young men, Plato and Xenophon, who were completely entranced by Socrates, who thought he was a wonderful, a moral, a clever, a brilliant man, both wrote voluminous semi-biographical accounts of Socrates. In the case of Plato, he concentrated on the philosophical ideas and the conversations and the dialectic. In the case of Xenophon, much more everyday conversations and thoughts of Socrates. But both of them essentially wrote these long treatises and books about Socrates because they wanted to show the world that he had been unjustly executed. So this is often called the apologetic purpose of Plato and Xenophon. They are writing to show that despite him having been accused of not believing in the gods of Athens, despite him having been arraigned on this charge of introducing new kinds of God and corrupting young men, he was nothing of the sort. He was a conventionally pious man. So in Plato and Xenophon's dialogues, he talks about the gods of Athens, just as any other Athenian might. He was someone who was only interested in helping the young to improve their lives, to understand what the good life is, to improve their souls. And this is what comes across very strongly in Plato and Xenophon, that Socrates' execution was clearly a completely unjust thing. This is why they write those dialogues. In the case of Plato, dialogues because they are these conversations mapped onto what Socrates himself believed. You cannot learn, he thought, from just reading a text, from reading a doctrine. You can only learn by interchange. So this new literary genre of the dialogue is then created by Plato to model what Socrates himself had done. And great dialogues like the Republic, which is about what is justice, or like the Symposium, in which the discussion is what is love. These are dialogues which try to suggest that this was the method of Socrates himself. Now, the problem is that Plato went further than that. So he started writing his dialogues probably well after Socrates had actually died. He started with semi-biographical ones, such as the Apology, the defense speech, and the death scene in Plato's Phaedo, in which Socrates drinks the hemlock. But he went on to write much bigger dialogues in which he actually comes up with some answers. And the Platonic theory of ideas or forms is something that we learn from Aristotle, who was Plato's pupil, was not something Socrates himself had come up with. So Aristotle actually tells us that Socrates was really only interested in his questioning and in coming to general definitions, and from moving from the particular to the general. These were key Socratic methods. Whereas Plato actually ends up by saying that there is another realm, the realm of ideas. Those ideas about justice or goodness exist in this divine realm, which we cannot ever attain. We can only ever strain towards. Perhaps our souls, when we die, become more clearly in contact with that divine realm. That's what Plato suggested. And that is how we have knowledge, because knowledge of those things lasts when our souls are re-embodied and we become human again. So there's a kind of metaphysical notion in Plato of the ideas of everything being in this divine realm. That is not something Socrates thought. Socrates seems to have been a much more down-to-earth thinker. But Plato does preserve quite a lot of evidence for Socrates' early life. But he does so starting quite late on the whole. So in Plato's Symposium, we learn that Socrates was a very effective, brave, and strong soldier. He was a hoplite soldier. And Plato gives a wonderful account, which I slightly dramatize in my book, of a battle, the Battle of Potidaea in 432 BC, when Socrates would have been in his late 30s, in which Socrates goes into the battle line to save his dear young friend, Alcibiades, who's serving on that campaign, and he rescues him bodily from the thick of battle and brings him out safely with his armor. This is a very brave and effective fighter, but one of the things that's clear from Plato's account, and this is not the only campaign, he mentions three in which Socrates fought for Athens. Okay, they're all in his 30s and 40s, but Socrates fought as a hoplite soldier. And to be a hoplite soldier, one had to have a panoply, a coat of arms, which included one's helmet and one's shield and one's spear and one's greaves and one's breastplate. And these were expensive. To be a hoplite, you actually had to pass a property qualification. Socrates was not a poor man. So this already militates against the standard image that people have of Socrates, which is that he came from a very poor background. He was always a poor man. He walked around barefoot and in rags because of his poverty. But actually, Plato quotes Socrates in the Apology as saying, I chose poverty because I had to follow my mission, the mission that was given to me by the god Apollo after he told me I was the wisest man, to discover the truth. That is my mission, he said. I'm not a wise man. Greek word for wise is sophos. I'm not a sophos, he said. I'm a philosophos, a lover of wisdom. And a lover is someone who is striving, who is pursuing. And that's something that comes across in the doctrine of love that we learn in Plato's wonderful dialogue, the Symposium, in which you have a group of men at a party. They decide not to drink, but to talk about love instead and to praise love. And after 5 of them have given various wonderful accounts of what they think love is, Socrates says, well, these are all very well. Some of them are quite amusing. Aristophanes, the comic poet, is in that party. And he says, well, love is like finding your other half. Originally, human beings had 4 arms, 4 legs, and we were very self-sufficient. But then Zeus, the chief of the gods, split us in half. So now we only have 2 of each. But when he split us in half, we kept wanting to find our other half. And then they died off and we couldn't find our other half, but we're always looking for it. So this is a wonderful story, comic story by the comic playwright Aristophanes, or rather put into his mouth by Plato. The idea that love is finding your other half. And Socrates comes to this discussion and says, look, these are all fun pictures of love, but let me tell you the truth, because I know the truth about love. Well, this is an extraordinary statement from someone who says, the one thing I know is I know nothing, but actually I happen to know about love. How does he happen to know about love when he knows nothing else, even though he can discuss justice and courage and truth and goodness till the cows come home? He says, I know the truth about love because I was taught it by a clever woman. That clever woman is called Diotima. So sometime in the past, he says, Diotima, in more than one conversation, and I discussed love, and she taught me what it was. The problem is that Diotima doesn't exist in any other context. People have assumed it's a Platonic fiction. Who was this clever woman who taught Socrates about love? She's been dismissed as a fiction, a sort of way of getting a doctrine of love to be put into Socrates' mouth. So when I was thinking about Socrates' early life and thinking this is an unusual situation, I looked at the way Diotima is introduced in the Dialogue Symposium, and it's very specific, surprisingly specific. It says that this was a woman who was very clever, and amongst other things, she postponed the plague at Athens by 10 years, when the Athenians were sacrificing in order to ward it off. Well, we know when the plague happened at Athens. It's very topical, of course, because we are all undergoing the plague at the moment. But in Athens, a terrible plague struck the city in 430 BC. So if someone was trying to ward off the plague 10 years earlier, which is how Socrates introduces Diotima, this so-called fiction, she would have been active in 440. And the question arose to me, well, why would anybody who wanted to try and ward the plague off by means of sacrifices, which is what Socrates says, in 440 BC? And the answer was absolutely clear immediately, because any historian of the period knows, in 440 BC, the leader of Athens, Pericles, went on an expedition to conquer the island of Samos, and in the course of that campaign, a 10-month campaign, he did some really brutal things, one of which was crucifying the commanders of the other side and then throwing out their bodies without burial. Now that's the kind of action which the ancient Greeks university would have thought will lead to divine retribution. And the standard form of divine retribution is a plague. We know that from the opening of the Iliad, for example. So presumably, that introduction of Diotima is meant to make the reader think, this woman was active at the time when Pericles was behaving in such a way that a plague should have been inflicted on the Athenians, but it wasn't. 10 years later, it was. And in the course of that plague, Pericles died. So people were presumably saying, why wasn't there a plague 10 years earlier? Because, amongst other things, perhaps a clever woman arranged for sacrifices to propitiate the gods. Well, the thing is, there is only one clever woman in the picture in 440, and that is an amazing woman called Aspasia of Miletus. Miletus, a colony of Greeks in Asia Minor, and this young woman, Aspasia, came from that colony, aged around 20, to Athens, and she eventually ended up as the wife or consort of Pericles himself. So if anyone was interested to avert the plague that Pericles might have brought onto the Athenians, then it would have been her. So I think Plato is telling us that Diotima is a real person, and that person at least is modeled on the real person Aspasia. And the name Diotima then also starts to make sense, because it means in Greek honored by Zeus, and Zeus was a nickname given to Pericles because Pericles thundered like Zeus was the thunderer. Pericles was an Olympian orator, and he was known by the comic poets, widely known as Zeus. And so honored by Zeus immediately points to someone honored by Pericles. And again, we have information from another historian, Plutarch, that Pericles gave enormous honor to Aspasia in the 15 or 16 years in which they were together. And he listened to her, and she influenced him. And there's one other dialogue by Plato called the Menexenus, in which one other woman instructs Socrates, and that woman is Aspasia. And in that dialogue, which has often been dismissed as a joke, so scholars can pick and choose, they can decide we'll take the Symposium as biographical, but not the Menexenus. But I thought, well, why not the Menexenus? In that dialogue, Aspasia not only teaches Socrates how to give a funeral speech, but she says, this was the funeral speech that I taught Pericles. Pericles gave a famous funeral speech in 430 BC. So I thought, well, perhaps one ought to take seriously the notion that Aspasia was behind the Diotima, who is the teacher of Socrates, particularly in regard to the doctrine of love. And that doctrine of love in the Symposium does exactly those things Aristotle tells us that Socrates was famous for. It takes the notion of particulars, so loving an individual, and makes them more general. So Socrates says you start by loving individuals, but you go up the ladder of love until you realize that what you're loving is love itself or beauty itself. And so that's moving from the particularity of loving an individual to loving beauty, whatever is beautiful inside the beloved. And also that demonstrates, the doctrine of Diotima demonstrates the notion that Aristotle tells us was key to Socrates' method, which is that of definition. So before you can say that you love someone or this is love, like the other speakers in the Symposium, you have to ask the question, what is love itself? A very Socratic move. If Diotima is Aspasia, and if those moves define your terms first and then move from particularity to generality, can be attributed to a real woman and not to a fiction, then we have to rehabilitate Aspasia as one of the key influences on Socrates. And that is what I say in my book, and I bring in other evidence to show that Aspasia was almost certainly the clever woman that Plato actually calls her, and indeed Xenophon, and not what we learn from the comic playwrights of the day, which is that she was a prostitute, that she was a brothel keeper, she was all sorts of things. The kind of thing perhaps that typically misogynistic male comic poets might say about a woman who was genuinely clever, genuinely influential on Pericles, her husband, during the period when she was with him, and genuinely influential intellectually, as I believe, if one can ties up the dates and shows that she must have been the person who postponed the plague by 10 years by sacrifices and is therefore the Diotima of Plato's Symposium.
Thank you very much, Armand. That's extremely interesting. Let's see if we've got some questions. So here is one that a member of the audience has asked: why did you decide to research Socrates' youth? What particularly interested you in this period of his life?
The reason I started to research Socrates' youth was that I've been teaching for about 20 years a course in which there are two texts. One is Aristophanes, the comic playwright, who wrote a play called Clouds, which is, for some people, the earliest evidence for a middle-aged Socrates. The Clouds was performed in 423 BC, and the central character of the Clouds is a character called Socrates, the philosopher. And in that, Socrates comes across as a rather scurrilous, argumentative teacher, and also someone interested in physical science. So he does experiments. I mean, they're ludicrous experiments for the comic playwright's purposes, such as trying to measure how high a flea can jump by dipping its legs in wax and measuring the wax boots. I mean, not an actual experiment you could undertake, but the idea of an experiment to measure the flea's jump is very unusual for this time. So the idea of an empirical investigation. So one of the things that the Clouds has made scholars question is whether Socrates originally was like the so-called pre-Socratics, interested in physical questions, interested in empirical investigations. And most people think that was probably what he was before he turned into the ethical philosopher that we know. So I wondered about that. That was one question. Another was a very important article by an American classicist called Graham, in which he uncovered some evidence for Socrates' youth. So we have sources other than Plato and Xenophon, one of whom is the very authoritative musical theorist called Aristophanes. And we learn from Aristophanes, who was writing a century after Socrates, in the century after Socrates, in the 4th century BC, but whose father possibly would have known Socrates. And Aristophanes tells us that when Socrates was 17, he was the beloved friend and lover indeed of an older philosopher called Archelaus. And we learn from Aristophanes and other sources that, Socrates and Archelaus together went to the island of Samos when Socrates was a young man. So I was wondering what this tells us. One of the things it confirms is that Socrates had a relatively elite background, because in classical Athens, you don't become the lover of an important older man in your youth unless you're already part of that elite society in which homosexuality was one of the things that went on. It was a way in which younger men were introduced to broader society. So I wondered how to put all this together, and I started looking at the earlier evidence for Socrates, the question of his birth from supposedly a stonemason called Sophroniskes, but in a time when Athens was building enormous amounts in stone and commissioning reliefs in stone. So the idea that he was a poor stonemason seemed to me to be probably an error. He may well have been a very wealthy stonemason. Socrates appears to have been very well educated and to have been introduced to elite men in his youth. And so I thought this picture needs to change, of Socrates as always being a poor boy growing up and then suddenly becoming a very brilliant, argumentative and clever philosopher who knows so much, according to Plato's dialogues. So that's what started me investigating his youth. And in the course of that, I then came across the idea that when he was a young man, he had met this very clever woman who I think was Aspasia. And when you start putting the dates together, you realize that Aspasia was roughly Socrates' age. She would have immigrated from Miletus to Athens when she was around 20 and he was around 20. She was then married to Pericles 5 years later. So we have a gap, we have a period when you have these two 20-year-olds, unusual, clever people, Aspasia a woman, Socrates a man, in Athens, both between the age of 20 and 25, and during that period perhaps Aspasia is talking to elite men. We learn this from one of the sources. Aspasia set up a kind of salon in Athens, they said, in which she spoke about love and marriage to elite Athenians, including Socrates. That seems to be the period. Whether or not they fell in love, whether or not they had any kind of affair is completely speculative. But it seems to me that if Aspasia can be identified with Diotima, then in those salons, she taught him a thing or two.
Well, thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions lining up.
I'll try and be brief.
So that's very good. One of them is about Aristophanes and his negative portrayal of Pericles and Aspasia, as well as Socrates in Clouds. Can you? The question is, how seriously should we take that?
There would seem to be quite a lot of anti-Pericles sentiment in Aristophanes. So in the Acharnians, one of his plays, the suggestion is that Pericles went to war with Sparta at the instigation of his prostitute wife, Aspasia, who was running a brothel, and some Peloponnesians stole a couple of the whores. And so she instigated the war with Sparta and its allies. Well, I mean, clearly this is comic slander. It does indicate that Pericles was unpopular for starting and keeping on promoting the war. As I said, he was unpopular with certainly the upper classes, and as a result, there was an attempt to overthrow the democratic system, which, it was a radical democracy where the people voted on things like war. So if you were a wealthy landed gent whose vines and olives are being destroyed by the Spartans in the course of this, you would say, well, let's stop this disastrous war, but the people would vote. And they say, no, we want to continue. And they kept on voting for aggressive action. So that hostility, I think, comes across in Aristophanes' plays. And he clearly was part of that conservative or upper class disinclination to perpetuate the war. I think the slander of Aspasia is something that goes back to other comic poets. So we have fragments of other comic poets where she is slandered in terms of being, for example, the consort of Zeus. So if Pericles is Zeus, she is Hera, the wife of Zeus. She's far too powerful. That was the point. And so what do? You drag her down by calling her, the wife of the chief of the gods. She is the mother of a bastard, one of them called her, because she was a non-Athenian, and there were rules against Athenians marrying non-Athenians. So when Pericles did it, he had to make an exception for his own son to be called an Athenian citizen, and so on. So I think there was a sense that Pericles himself was too powerful, he was doing the wrong things, and that Aspasia was behind this, and she needed to be pulled down as well.
I'm running through the many questions that have been sent in, and just following up with Aspasia. Someone asks, how can I read more about her life? Where would you go for a more detailed account of Aspasia?
Well, there is a book that was written in the 90s by Madeline Henry called Aspasia, Prisoner of History, which gives us a nice run through of all the evidence and indeed the reception, because so much of the history of an individual in the ancient world is about their reception, how they were received. So that's certainly true about Socrates. We have to learn about him through his reception by Plato and Xenophon. We learn about Aspasia from the way she was received by Plato and Xenophon, as I've said, actually in a very respectful manner by both of those serious biographers, and by the comic playwrights. And what is fascinating to me is that the comic playwrights are the only ones who say horrible things about her, and they call her a prostitute and a brothel keeper and all sorts of, as if the wife of the leader of Athens could have kept a brothel on the side for 15 years and run prostitutes from that. People have taken this seriously. People have taken comic slander seriously. It's an irony that they have taken comic playwrights seriously and serious authors as if they were joking when they say that Aspasia was genuinely an intellectual and someone who influenced Pericles' politics and speech writing. Why do that? Well, the answer, I think, is centuries of misogyny and male scholarship. And what's interesting is that actually a lot of scholars for centuries were a bit uncomfortable simply to take the comic playwrights' words that Aspasia was a prostitute and a brothel keeper. These are the words they use about her. So they thought, you know what, she can't have been exactly those things. But given that she came from Miletus in Asia Minor and therefore was not an Athenian, what she must have been was a courtesan. And courtesan, the Greek word is hetaira, were slightly elevated forms of women of ill repute, madams. They were high-class hookers, you might say. They were actually entitled to run brothels, and there was even a tax on their activities. So she was a courtesan. This has become the settled view, and if you look on Wikipedia, or if you look on many books about ancient Athens, you'll find Aspasia, the courtesan, is absolutely standard. I grew up with that notion. So when I started studying the period and looking into Aspasia in particular, I was expecting to find that she was described as a hetaira, a courtesan in the sources. Not a single ancient source actually calls her a hetaira. This was a nice middle ground for scholars. They didn't want to think she was a clever woman. They didn't want to think she was a common prostitute. So they settled on this middle ground. She was an upper class courtesan. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. You have to choose. And I don't choose the comic playwright slander. I choose Plato and Xenophon. She was a respectable, influential, important intellectual woman.
Wife, Xanthippe, what do we know about her?
Xanthippe is the only woman who Plato and Xenophon mention as associated with Socrates. But Plato tells us that they had a child when Socrates was in jail. At the age of 70, Xanthippe came with her young baby. So how old was Xanthippe when Socrates was 70? She'd had a young baby. She can't have been older than about 30. She's likely to be much younger. Let's say she was 25. When did Socrates meet her? 10 years earlier when she was 15, in which case he was 60. So to suggest that this was the only woman who Socrates was ever associated with seemed to me very unlikely. And so when you look at the sources, Aristotle tells us actually Socrates had been married to another woman before, and he names her as Myrto. So Myrto, we then learn, was the granddaughter of a very elite Athenian, again feeding into the view that Socrates was from an elite background himself, called Aristides. And Aristides' son Lysimachus, Plato tells us, was the best friend of Socrates' father, and they lived in the same deme or village. So suddenly you get a very different picture of Socrates' father and his best friend, this elite man called Lysimachus, and Lysimachus' daughter Myrto being married to Socrates. Well, when? We aren't told exactly when, but one assumes if they were the same age, Socrates presumably married Myrto when he was a youngish man. In which case, Plato has suppressed that. And I think we can work out why. It's easier for Plato just to talk about Xanthippe when in the Apology and in the other dialogues of Plato about Socrates' later life, Plato is trying to create a picture of Socrates as essentially not an elite individual. So Xanthippe, perhaps not a particularly elite woman, and the mother, according to Plato, of his 3 children, contradicted by Aristotle, who says the first 2 children were from his first wife, Myrto. So I think I go into this in the book, but I think that we have to form a different picture of the young Socrates married to Myrto, 2 children from that marriage, and then later in life, he meets Xanthippe, perhaps in his late 50s or 60s. They then have a 3rd child, and that child is still very young at the time of Socrates' execution.
Okay. Another question that's been sent in. I was interested in your claim that Socrates had been sentenced to death because of his support for the oligarchy rather than his alleged crime of corrupting the youth of Athens. What evidence is there for this? For example, did other supporters of the oligarchy meet the same fate? You get that?
So, yes, the proof, well, the suggestion that the accusation of corrupting the youth is in fact a political one. It's not my own suggestion, but it's one that is quite commonly held, because what does it mean to corrupt young men? Well, it could imply, as I suggested, some sort of sexual thing, but actually there's no evidence or suggestion that Socrates did anything particularly sexual in his later life. In fact, the Symposium makes a huge case that Socrates refused to reciprocate the young man Alcibiades' advances, sexual advances, even though Socrates at that stage is much older and uglier, and Alcibiades is young and beautiful. Alcibiades' own testimony is that Socrates made no move in that respect because he was interested in the young man's soul, not his body. And that's where we get the notion of platonic love. So that is why I think we can then ask whether corrupting the youth had something to do with Socrates' teaching. And Socrates' teaching seems to have been not particularly anti-democratic. I mean, it wasn't of a political nature, but it clearly was the kind of teaching that questioned the way that the Athenian democracy might be run and organized, the idea that people who were not really in a position to know answers were voting on matters of life and death. So one can certainly read in the Platonic dialogues a kind of disapproval, certainly of Pericles, and of the kind of extreme democracy that Pericles brought in. And that might have then been seen as Socrates teaching young men that, and of course these young men would all have been elites because no one else would have flocked to listen to philosophers or sophists, clever experts, as Socrates was deemed to be. So there he is teaching young men, and these young men going on and being part of oligarchic subversion of democracy. And that, it seems to me, is a clear reason for why that accusation might be understood as political. Did it happen to others? Well, we don't know of trials, particularly of oligarchic supporters, but what happened actually in 403, after the imposition of an oligarchic junta on Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War, was that the democracy was reformed outside Athens. The Democrats came back in an army and they fought and killed a large number of the supporters of the oligarchy, including a man called Critias, who Socrates was known to have been a teacher of and was very much coupled with Alcibiades as the reason for Socrates' execution. So an orator called Aeschines, several decades later, in a speech says, you, the people of Athens, executed Socrates because he was the teacher of Critias and Alcibiades. So that gives us, I think, the evidence that people believed that Socrates' execution was political.
Okay, I think this might have to be the last question, Armand. It comes all the way from Canada, which impresses me. And it says this: I'm curious about how the references to Aspasia fit into the context of women in the literature of the time. Was it common to talk about women, let alone clever ones, in a philosophical work? Or was it mostly an old boys' club, is the question.
That's a very good question. And the answer is yes, it was an old boys' club. This is a very male-dominated society. Very few women are known about, historical women. And those that are tend to be very much in the background. They're priestesses or religious people. On the whole, women are at home, that is, freeborn women. We learn about prostitutes who become somewhat, or other courtesans who become somewhat more influential in the slightly later period of the 5th century. But in the 5th century BC, very rare to hear about women. And in that sense, Aspasia is an extraordinary exception. We have to accept that. She is exceptional as a human individual, but exceptional in the fact that she is spoken about to such a degree, and spoken about in such contradictory ways. As I say, on the one hand, in the comic playwrights and the fragments of the comedians, someone who is reviled and vilified and called all sorts of ghastly things like prostitute and brothel keeper, but at the same time recognized for her influence because she is equated with these mythical characters like Hera, wife of Zeus, or Deianira, who poisoned Heracles, or Omphale, or various other mythical heroines. That is Aspasia in the comic playwrights. And in Plato, well, a whole dialogue, the Menexenus, in which Aspasia herself is teaching Socrates. That is extraordinary. And another dialogue, the only other dialogue in which Socrates is taught by anyone, and it's by a woman, is the Symposium. And there that woman is Diotima. So if one were saying, well, what is the evidence for clever women in ancient Athens? Well, there were two. There was Aspasia and there was Diotima. Well, it seems likely that they were one and the same, and that this was Aspasia, the very exceptional woman, and the subject of my next book, which will be very much about Aspasia and Pericles and the whole background which allowed Aspasia to become this extraordinary, influential intellectual in her time.
Thank you very much for that, Armand. I think, alas, it's time for us to draw it to a close. It remains for me to thank you so much for most entertaining and instructive account, most extraordinary story in a way. And for anyone who hasn't read your book, I would strongly recommend it. It's a wonderful read, and it's full of interest and controversy, perhaps, but of an interesting kind. So thank you very much for that. Just before everyone goes, I've been asked just to make a couple of general announcements. The recording of this event will be from the Watch Again section of the festival website, although you should allow at least a couple of days for it to appear. We very much hope that you'll continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas. Check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for more details about events in the festival program. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on those events and continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. So thank you all for coming. And thank you again, Armand. It's been a most entertaining and instructive afternoon with you. So thank you all, and thank you, Armand. Goodbye.